Hello, Honors 100. So for today's class, I want to start off with a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, just a reminder, Monday is a holiday, so we will not have a required class session that day. I'll probably place a placeholder discussion post, mostly just to kind of keep us on track so it doesn't look like something's missing, and in case anybody wanted to ask any questions. But for Monday's class upcoming, participation will not be required. I'll again leave it open for questions, and I'll check it in case people do have questions for the whole class. But otherwise, enjoy the holidays. It's an unusual time to have a holiday because I know most of us are mostly remote, but hope you're able to enjoy the day to some extent. So with that out of the way, the other quick thing I want to mention, just as a reminder, the 5-paragraph essay assessment assignment, it's due 11 a.m. today. I expect probably by the time this video is posted, that time will have passed. At this very moment, I have, I think, about 3/4 of them in, which is great. So most of you have, done what you're supposed to do. If you're one of the folks who had not turned it in yet, and if this somehow slipped your mind or you misunderstood the due date earlier, please try to get that in as soon as possible. I usually give a very brief kind of grace period around 10 to 15 minutes, just because I know upload issues happen if you were, uploading at the relative last minute. But if it's any later than that, there will be a small deduction, and from there you start losing credit by the day that it comes in late. Again, this is meant to be a pretty low-key assignment, a relatively easy way to rack up at least 4 out of 5 points for most of you, I expect, and I expect a number of you will get the full credit for this one. I look forward to reading those. So the way I'll grade most assignments for this class is on a rolling basis. So when I say that, what that means is it doesn't mean I'm going to post all the grades all at once. So the way that I think it happens, more traditionally in high school settings and often in college as well. The way I tend to do it, because the grading is online, is I will grade it as I kind of come to them and post grades either in a batch or even one by one sometimes. So the net effect of that is some of you will probably have your scores as well as feedback from me as soon as tomorrow. And some of you, it might be another couple days. Unless something really unexpected happens, I expect I'll grade at least all the ones that come in on time by the end of the weekend, and hopefully even sooner than that. But please make sure you're just keeping an eye out when they do come to you. Again, for everyone, I will give some feedback. If you can't see that feedback, there's always a chance that just human error on my part. I didn't paste it in correctly, or always a chance that I know for many of you, Canvas is a new platform, and so it might be that you're just not sure how to navigate there. I might be able to help you do that. But rest assured, everyone should have at least a paragraph or so of feedback from me, even if it's a really good paper and I'm just kind of reinforcing all the things you did well. But I found historically for almost all assignments, even really good ones, I do have some constructive criticism or things I'd like to see done even better for future assignments. And on the flip side of that, again, even for ones that are not as successful, usually I have some positive things to say. So it's not all doom and gloom. Please do make sure you're reading that feedback, though. That's one of the main ways that the teaching happens, especially in this online format where I'm not as kind of going desk to desk and kind of checking in with people. Giving you that written feedback is a really important part of the class, and I do often not deduct credit, not have you lose points over stuff the first time it happens, but if I've given you the correction and you're still making the exact same mistake the next time, that's where you might lose credit because now you've kind of had your warning or you've had the correction already. But yeah, really looking forward to those. And again, some of you will probably start seeing scores and feedback as soon as tomorrow, and for the rest of you, again, I'm hopeful before the end of the weekend I'll have all of those posted. So for the rest of today's class, I have 3 main segments that I'm intending to hit on. I'm going to start with the APIA, the reading that we did for this time from the textbook, and just kind of, as usual, giving some guiding questions and jumping to some certain places in the text. I decided to front load this because I feel like I gave the Ansel Dua essay kind of short shrift last time, so I wanted to make sure I did this one up front so that we got more fair treatment of it. And then my plan is I'm going to introduce our next assignment, the initial artifact analysis. You still got a solid, I think it's about 2 weeks or so before that's due. So it's not a pressure situation. It's a relatively short assignment, but I want to introduce it just so you have the beginnings of tools to start thinking about this assignment. For those of you who like to work ahead, there's no reason not to. You certainly can get started on this assignment. You might refine the way you think about this assignment in the next few class periods because we're going to do some exercises to kind of help us with this assignment. So I'd encourage you, if you want to start working on draft, that's great, but you don't need to submit it, much before the due date, because it might affect how you think about the assignment as we go on in the next few video lectures and discussions. And then we're going to wrap up class with some practice analysis. And so I have a couple artifacts, and I'll talk about what an artifact is a little bit more, that I'm going to show us and give us an opportunity where I'm going to do kind of a walkthrough of the way that I would approach analyzing a very simple artifact, and then I'm going to suggest for all of you an artifact that you can handle in the discussion thread. A couple people brought up questions along this line last time. I'm going to continue for many of our classes when we have kind of discrete sections of the class, opening separate sub-threads in the discussion thread. You only need to participate in one to earn credit. I encourage you to participate in all the different segments that I open or sub-threads that I open, just for your own enrichment and your own kind of ability to participate in the discussion and, learn from it. But in terms of earning credit for the class, you only need to participate in one of those sub-threads with a substantive comment. Again, I encourage you interact with each other, participate more than once. That's a great thing. You can kind of help sure up you get full credit for this aspect of the class, but you won't lose credit in any significant way if you only choose to participate in one part of it, or you only have something to say about one part of it because you just don't have other observations or questions you want to bring up about the other aspects of the class. So I hope that's all clear. Please do keep the questions coming. I'm the kind of professor, I like to think, at least of myself, I'll never get frustrated or angry or upset with you if you ask a question. I might get a little bit irritated if the question just hasn't been asked, or someone else has already asked it and I've answered it and you've clearly not read the response or not watched the video. So that's all, again, a way of saying please do ask the questions. Even if it's already been asked, if you're still not clear on it, feel free to ask again. I don't mind that, either via private message to me if it's something more particular to yourself, or you can post it in the discussion thread. And I'm happy to field those there. But usually, at least during the more business day kind of hours, especially the morning into the early afternoon, I'm responding to messages within a couple hours of when they're either posted on the discussion thread or when they're emailed to me. And if it's something that comes in after hours, it might be that I don't get to it till the following morning. But I usually do try to. That's one of the first things I do when I get to the desk. So anyway, let's get into the actual class. Enough preamble. So for the APIA, the first place I want to take this is right at the beginning of the piece on page 42. And again, this is in your Ways of Reading textbooks, page 42. We have APIA. He's citing some insights from W.E.B. Du Bois. I always mispronounce that, and I feel like different people will pronounce it different ways, so I'm always self-conscious about that. So apologies if you have a different pronunciation that you're accustomed to. But he gives kind of this idea of, to him, what race does or does not mean. And it's in this offset, kind of part right here towards the beginning, where he suggests the leading scientists of the world have come forward and laid down in categorical terms a series of propositions, which may be summarized as follows. 1, it is not legitimate to argue from differences in physical characteristics to differences in mental characteristics. And 2, the civilization of a race at any particular moment of time offers no index to its innate or inherited capacities. So I'm going to dumb that down a little bit. I expect most of you, probably get it. I don't think those are revolutionary ideas. But basically what he's saying is race is a construct. So what someone looks like doesn't say anything about their abilities or their intellect or so on and so forth. And similarly, just because they're treated in a certain way in their culture, that doesn't say anything about their abilities or their interests or their value or capacities or whatnot. So it's all just kind of what we impose on these things. And it's an important concept for what Appiah is saying here. He gets into the effects of race, and he talks about social effects in terms of how people are seen or how people are treated by each other. He gets into psychological pieces in terms of how people see themselves, how they shape their identity. And so even though it's this constructed thing that doesn't necessarily have inherent meaning, it does have a real impact on people, right? And kind of their interactions with others, and again, how they think of themselves. And on page 45, he gets into this concept of ascription of racial identities. And basically, it's this process of applying a label to people or even to ourselves. And he gets into this idea of how we kind of perform our identity, right? So, to give an example of that, socioeconomically speaking, if I'm talking to some of my friends from college, especially those who have gone on to, pretty lucrative careers. Some of them have gone to law school and are successful attorneys now. I might go out to dinner with them and say I'm poor, right? So I'm just going to drink water rather than getting a nice glass of wine, or I might kind of apologize for the car that I'm driving. And in that way, I'm sort of performing being poor or performing being less affluent in that situation. When more objectively, more realistically, I'm pretty comfortably middle class, right? Which I expect that many of you would identify with, or maybe some of you would even consider me to be on the wealthy end of the spectrum, because it is such a relative thing, right? But I would perform a certain kind of status, right, based on kind of the company I'm keeping and how I kind of see myself. I would ascribe that identity to myself. So Pia gets much more into this, again, in a context of race and kind of, performing being black, performing being white, performing being Asian, so on and so forth, which I think is a pretty interesting discussion. And so one of the questions I'm going to introduce to you all is just this question of ways in which you perform your identity. And we can certainly get into race here. I'm not looking to steer us away from that. But you can also take it in other directions. I think we all have some degree of identity that we sort of attach to ourselves. For example, if you're a gamer, right, you might have certain games that you kind of identify with, and certain ones you kind of turn your nose up as being regarded as objectively bad in your community, or certain styles of play like button mashing, right, that are kind of looked down upon among more skilled gamers generally. My gaming terms are outdated. I used to play a lot of video games kind of from middle school and earlier, but I haven't played much since kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, so excuse me if my references are too outdated there, but I think they more or less translate at least. But okay, let's skip ahead here to page 50 in the text here. There's this quote here. Let's see here. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of in the lower middle of the page here. The notion that what has held the United States together historically over its great geographical range is a common culture, like the common culture of my traditional society is, to put it politely, not sociologically plausible. So yeah, I'm going to dumb down the language a little bit there. I expect many of you can parse that, but basically Appiah is suggesting this idea that there's going to be a common culture of the United States, that we're all kind of the same on a fundamental level. He's suggesting that's not even possible. It's not even plausible that could happen, right? And he goes into this a little bit more about his rationale for that, both before and after that point. But I'm curious what people think about that. Is there a unified U.S. culture? Are there pieces that we can reasonably attribute to everyone, or at least enough of a quorum of people that we could call it part of the American culture? I think there are some pieces that are arguable. But I do think Appiah is also on to something that it's not as simple as some people might lay it out to be, right? And I'll use a really generalized example, which if anyone wants to expound on, please feel free to. But this example of McDonald's, right? I think a lot of people would attribute it as being a very American thing. It's something we've exported to a lot of other countries as a fast food chain, and kind of a culture of, unhealthy food and disposable, product in terms of all the packaging that comes with it, and disposable cups and fry containers and all things along those lines. One could certainly make an argument that's representative of American culture, because there's a large percentage of our country that engages to varying degrees with that. But I think that there's also a reasonable counter argument that a lot of people don't engage with that, right? There's actually a pretty vocal percentage of people who, for a combination of, economic and kind of ethical reasons, as well as, health reasons, and kind of across the spectrum, do not participate in that part of the culture or are vocally against it. So there's always a range there, right? But I'd be interested to hear what people think about what American culture there is and kind of what that means at this point. Okay, let's see. I'm going to catch just one other point here. On page 61. There's this line here about many people believe, this is the last paragraph here, and like the second sentence in, many people believe that the global homogenization of culture impoverishes the cultural fabric of our lives. I think it's a really interesting idea. So the global homogenization, in other words, making everything the same. So not just even an American culture we're trying to say is the same, but like a global culture. So this idea that something has expanded so that everybody is sort of into it, and the idea that it impoverishes the cultural fabric of our lives. And if I'm interpreting this the way I would kind of see it, weakening individual cultures. So, for example, if we all eat Mexican food, that weakens Mexican culture because it's no longer a thing unique to that culture. It's a thing that is attributed to everyone at that point. And he grapples with this idea. He's not necessarily arguing that is the case, but he kind of raises that as a discussion point in the text here. And I'm really curious as to what people think about that as well. So, as is the case for all of the readings, I've given you, a good 4 or 5 places to pay attention to in the text and, brought up a few questions related to those points. In the discussion thread, feel free to respond to the questions I've introduced. Feel free also to go to other places in the text as well and other things that stood out to you. Obviously, you've been doing a great job, so many of you now, turning in your reading response journal entries and doing that kind of work. Feel free to bring in points you've already journaled about in kind of a more condensed form just to give the class some, food for thought, or just other things we haven't really engaged with yet, but you want to introduce in the class discussion. That can be really useful. So, okay, so we have that kind of set up. I'm going to go ahead and transition to our next portion of the class, which is talking about this next assignment we have coming up, the initial artifact analysis. And I'm going to give a relatively abbreviated run through of it today. In large part because I think it's actually a simpler assignment than I think some students make it out to be. And so just kind of reading it over for yourself, the assignment prompt, and kind of meditating on it, I think you often get more out of than me giving a big elaborate spiel about it. But just to run through, so I'm going to post the assignment prompt and grade guide here. It'll also be available in the actual assignment submission folder as well. But so, in terms of what this assignment is, it's another short paper, only 2 to 3 pages in length. But what this one is doing is not making an argument, but rather looking at an artifact and just kind of analyzing to see what you think it means, what it's doing, how it's operating, so on and so forth. So when I say artifact, I mentioned this in our first or second class, but it's basically just anything that a person or people made. So I think, in the previous example, I referenced, the shirt that I was wearing and the choices that were made in terms of the colors that were used and the way that it was produced and materials that were used and so on and so forth. Similarly, behind me, there's a bookshelf. There's, however many 100 books, lined up here. Those are all artifacts, right? Because those are all made by a person or more likely a combination of people in most cases. So for the purposes of the initial artifact analysis assignment, what I would push you to do is to pick an artifact that is simultaneously complex enough that you could write about it for 2 to 3 pages. So, for example, a still image often doesn't give us enough to work with. If you're really good at this, you certainly could make it work, but it's going to be more challenging. On the flip side of that, a whole novel or a whole film or a whole TV series, way too big for this. Even a whole TV episode is really, in most cases, too big for this kind of assignment. We're looking for kind of small, finite things, again, that have some meaty stuff to analyze there. So I'm going to run through some examples of good artifacts I've seen students use in the past. This is not an exhaustive list. You certainly could come up with other things, but just by way of getting you thinking of the kind of scope you want for this. A music video or a song. Those are really good examples because usually they're under 5 minutes long. Again, have, with the song, music, lyrics, rhythm, often references to outside things. All of that, gives you fodder to work with. A music video, if you're nervous about having enough content, you take all of the qualities of a song and add in whatever story it's telling, whatever the musical artist is wearing in that video, the facial expressions they're making, all that kind of stuff just gives you that much more material to work with. A commercial. Commercials are generally shorter, closer to like 30 seconds to a minute or so, but still that can totally work. Again, especially if you're prepared to really just drill in, watch this over and over again, you'll be surprised at how much you can find in these things. A movie trailer, a single scene from a movie. Again, a whole movie is going to be way too big for the purposes of this project, but something like 5 minutes or so or less usually is pretty successful for this assignment. A single poem, a single scene from a novel. Again, a whole novel is going to be too big, but a scene of it that's like 5-6 pages or so, that could work for this assignment. So with that, you're gonna spend 2 to 3 pages again, just kind of picking this thing apart. When we get into the what isn't this assignment section, we're not evaluating if it's good or bad, and we're not doing research for this aspect of it. But rather, you're just kind of trying to pick apart how you think this thing works, why the artist made the choice they made when they made this thing, what they're trying to convince us of, and how we know, right? Just kind of thinking about those rhetorical appeals we talked about of logos, pathos, ethos. What logical argument is this thing making essentially, or what emotional argument is this making for us, or what signs of credibility do we have here? What's the context or the kairos that this created in? So as it says here, this is I'm looking back at the prompt in the second paragraph under what isn't this assignment. Don't settle on essential arguments. So this is not a thesis driven essay. This is simply an exploration of the item at hand. We're going to get to the essay part. This is a way of building to a more advanced essay, though, is to first just pick an artifact and kind of analyze what's going on with it. And then that last paragraph under what isn't this assignment says it's not just about simple description and summary. So it's going to be necessary to summarize your artifact to some extent, just so I know what you're talking about in the first place. But you're focusing more on, again, what we think these things mean, what we can pull from it, why the artist or the creator or whatnot has made the choices that they have made. So it's going to be due Monday, September 14th. That's not quite 2 weeks from now, but it's a solid week and a half, right? So you do have a fair amount of time to work on this. In contrast to the initial 5-paragraph assessment essay, I am going to evaluate this a little more critically. So it's not just sort of if you turn it in on time, you're going to get close to full credit. It is more of an assignment where I do expect you to kind of follow the steps I've laid out above in terms of, again, trying to pick apart what details you find here and what you think they mean, how it's using rhetoric to convince us of something. Right? So I know that this all might seem kind of abstract now. We're going to do practice with artifacts. So I'm going to transition to the last part of the class, although again, you have the prompt there, also in the discussion thread. You also have the grade guide, kind of a rubric just to kind of reiterate and guide you through some of the key elements of this assignment. The pieces of mechanics and sort of perfect grammar and formatting and all that are less important than the content of this thing. That you're doing analytical work and that you're again kind of studying what rhetoric is at play. Okay, so by way of demonstration, though, I have 2 artifacts I'm going to post below in this discussion thread, and they are 2 different album covers, both of which I expect many of you may have seen. One I expect more of you will more readily recognize and remember because it's much more recent. The other which you might not recognize as immediately. So the more recognizable one, and the one I'm going to invite you to engage in some analysis with on the discussion thread, is the cover to Taylor Swift's most recent album, Folklore, which she had the surprise release of this summer. I like the album. We can talk about that if folks are interested. But for now, we're going to focus purely on the image of the cover that's included there. And if you don't like Swift, whether you like Swift, that's more or less neither here nor there for this discussion, right? Because we're focusing not on whether it's good or bad or making an argument about it so much as why we think she made the choices she did in terms of what image she's rendering there, the color choices kind of incorporated there, things along those lines. So I'm not going to say too much more about Swift because I want to leave that wide open for the discussion thread to tackle, but I am going to get into the other, sorry, I bumped my desk and slid my whole camera over. Get into the other image though. So this is, I've done a printout of it as well, just so you know which image I'm talking about pretty clearly. The U2 album cover for the album called Songs of Innocence. So to give you the kairos for this one, and the reason why I expect many of you may have encountered it, even if you don't remember it off the bat, this was an album that in 2014, U2 partnered with Apple, immediately downloaded to people's devices. So their iTunes, their iPhones, their laptops, whatever Apple devices they had where they had music, it did an automatic free download, which was a little bit of a controversial thing at the time, right? On the plus side, it's like it's free music. Everyone likes getting something for free, and U2 is a major band, a fairly popular band, so there's a reasonable chance people would like this, but a lot of people don't like U2, right? Or maybe their phone was already full, they didn't want to download to automatically happen. So there was some pushback against this tactic. I think it's part of why we haven't really seen Apple repeat this all that much. But so with this, the reason I wanted to look at this particular image, and feel free to scroll down while I'm talking through this because you have a clearer image of it that I'm posting around Canvas that's full color, although there's not much color to look at here. But with this, the reason I wanted to select this artifact is because this is about as simple an artifact as I can imagine in a lot of ways. So much kind of blank space to it. Black and white for the most part, and yet still, it's just there's a lot packed into it that we could analyze. So the artifacts that you're going to select, I'm going to suggest that they're more complex things than this. Again, songs, music videos, commercials, movie trailers, full poems or scenes from stories or movies. But to use this as an example, and just one that I can do in a few minutes, but still pull a fair bit out of. So in terms of ethos, right? They stamp U2 really prominently here. They're making a decision there, right? Where they're saying people know who this band is. We don't need to sell them on some super provocative image. We just need to let them know who the band is and they'll be excited. May or may not be true, right? The fact that it was automatically downloaded via iTunes, that is also some degree of source of credibility, right? Of that, if I were to record an album, I'm not a musician, but if I were, or if nonetheless I tried to record something, I couldn't get Apple to automatically put that on everyone's devices, right? U2 could do that though. So again, it's asserting their credibility, and that's in combination with the context, the kairos of this thing. In terms of pathos here, we might notice it says LP here, right, on this cover. What that stands for is long play. That was traditionally the title for a full album. So it would be, there'd be singles, which we're mostly familiar with, individual songs that you could buy. There were EPs, which were typically like 5 or 6 songs, so kind of like half an album. An LP, long play, that'd be a full album. So this goes back to the days of records when they'd be different physical sizes of media and all of that. When we look at this overall image, it's sort of like a Rorschach test in a way, where what you're kind of thinking about or what you're familiar with will often guide what you see. Especially with the LP label, I think it's reasonable. Someone could see vinyl here, right? They could see an actual record, maybe in its white sleeve. But you could look at this and imagine it's an album, right? An actual, actual record. For my generation more so, when I look at this, I think of it more as being like a burned CD, right? That was what we would do when I was in college. You have a burner on your usually desktop computer. You put a blank CD in there and you burn your favorite songs onto it. You burn a playlist for the girl you're interested in who will subsequently reject you because that's a lame way to go for a girlfriend. No offense intended. But nonetheless, you can make these things yourself. And the handwritten nature of it also kind of guides me there that there's a little bit of that at play, that they're referencing that part of music history and how people would consume music. Also, though, if anyone remembers iPods, right? I expect many of you, by the time you had your own devices, that was already kind of an outdated technology, but you might still remember it, right? Because maybe when you were a child, maybe your parents or an older sibling or or people you knew in your life had these things where you would be able to turn that little white piece to kind of go forward or backward in an album. I think it could also look sort of like that again, especially the white coloring of it. I think sort of invites us back to that image. So there's a lot packed in here, and I put this all under pathos, emotion, because I think that there's an element of nostalgia U2 is trying to bring to us, right? They're a relatively old band, especially by that point they released this album, and the title of this thing is Songs of Innocence. So it's the idea of taking us back to an earlier point in our lives, in our music fanhood, so on and so forth. And in terms of logos, again, this is largely a rehash of some things that we've talked about already, but the logic of it's U2 is such a known band that you're going to want this thing. The LP tells us it's a full album. It's very just kind of bare bones informational. There's the date written there as well. Just gives us the information we need to understand what this thing is. The color scheme here, again, just to kind of carry on the analysis, I would suggest it's very simple. Again, it's Songs of Innocence. We think of white. It's often associated with things like purity in a lot of cultures. If we think about, we're trying to recreate this image and represent it in different places. A black and white image you can readily reprint in newspapers and other black and white kind of media. So it serves a number of functions in that way as well. We certainly could go further in depth on this, but I think you get the point, right? Just in talking about this for the last 3 or 4 minutes or whatever it was. despite being such a simple image, we can actually pull a deceptively large amount about it. I think I could write a 2 to 3 page paper analyzing that cover. I don't recommend you pick something as challenging or as kind of bare bones as that for your papers, but you certainly could. I encourage you to pick an artifact that you like, that you're not going to mind, rewatching or re-looking at or rereading over and over again. But at the same time, maybe not necessarily your favorite thing. Because I have a number of students say that after they write this first assignment, they're really sick of their artifact. And to give a kind of spoiler, we will get into some other assignments related to the artifact down the road. So you're not even going to be done with it after this assignment. So pick something that you like, but that, again, you're not going to, lose a favorite over it. I'm going to encourage you to be thinking about artifacts you might use. You don't need to commit to one just yet, although if you have one in mind, great. But when we come back after the Labor Day break, we're going to do more kind of conscious brainstorming and collecting of ideas of what people are thinking about, just to make sure everyone's on the right track for this assignment. So for now, again, just be thinking about it, maybe doing some practice analysis on your own. But again, I've also put the cover of Taylor Swift's Folklore down here, so you can also use that for practice. So again, in the discussion thread below, don't feel obligated to participate in every part of this discussion, but I do welcome and encourage you to do that if you're so inclined. But if you don't have much to say about the APIA, or rather just be kind of a spectator for that discussion, that is fine. But you can spend that time rededicated to looking at the Taylor Swift album cover, and again, giving your analysis of that. And I'll weigh on that a little bit as well. But okay, I've got a little bit longer than I intended to, so thank you all so much for watching and listening. I look forward to reading your papers, and have a great Labor Day weekend. I will catch you next week.